Hey, what's going on, everyone? All right, so we'll begin soon. Let me just share this to the group. Give it 2 seconds. There we go. All right. Okay, cool. We'll just wait a second or two, and then we'll kind of begin from there. Quick sip of coffee here. Adjust this light a little bit. There we go. Okay, cool. So you guys, we did a few lives on lifestyle related stuff for a while. So I'm going to mix it up and go back to nutrition for a little bit. And we're going to be talking about a nuanced topic today, and that's sourcing high quality beef. And there's a lot of detail that goes into it, and it's easy to have like good intentions of sourcing high quality food, but very easy to get misled by all the greenwashing that goes on at the grocery store. You know, you have like a million different labels: non-GMO, organic, grass-fed, grass finished, 100% grass-fed, made with organic ingredients, keto certified, this certified, gluten-free certified. And at the end of the day, it's like you kind of wonder exactly how true a lot of these claims are. So we'll be covering that in relation to sourcing high quality beef in the US today. And this topic is so important because, like I mentioned on a lot of our lives, everything about you is made out of food. Your body, your mind, and your mind produces its thoughts, So obviously, if you're sourcing sick animals and sick plants grown with a lot of different chemicals, you yourself can't expect to have a healthy body or a healthy mind that produces healthy thoughts. It's just one goes with the other. Mark, what is going on? We're going to be covering how to source high quality beef today in the US. Seems like an easy topic, and a lot of people think they know quite a bit about this topic, but obviously a lot of people are quite lost in terms of what proper nutrition even looks like, with 9 out of 10 Americans right now being metabolically sick and 70% being obese. So when people are normalizing that kind of state of pathology, there's no way that they know what proper nutrition is, or under very small circumstances they may actually know, but then there is an inability to apply that knowledge. And obviously knowledge isn't power. Applied knowledge is power. That's what kind of gives you the results. It's what you could apply in the external world under external world demands, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes in healthcare, it's kind of a little bit tough because you're dealing with probably 95% of Americans are currently in the problem unaware stage of change, meaning they are actually very mentally and physically troubled, way more overweight than they actually think they are, but they're just completely unaware because although they may be on some high blood pressure and cholesterol meds and like 30 or 40 pounds overweight and looking 10 years older than they actually are, the guy next to them in the office is probably doing far worse. So in relation, they're like, well, I'm not doing so bad. This is, and they kind of do a positive reframe of some type of thing of like, oh, this is the normal part of aging, or it's my genetics, this high blood pressure and joint pain. It's because it's my age or whatever. It's like literally nothing to do with age or genetics. I mean, hypertension is kind of familial. Hypertension is like 1 out of every 500 people. So what are the chances of you being that 1 out of every 500? It's pretty small. And if it is the case, I would recommend going and playing the lottery because your luck is quite high. Same exact thing with depression. A lot of people still think depression is kind of genetic, or there's a chemical imbalance in your brain and that is solely what is causing your depression. But that's been chemical imbalance theory of depression has been disproven a long time ago, and no one takes that seriously in psychiatry or psychology anymore. But yet the majority of people think like their depression is due to some kind of genetic thing, not the fact that they're living completely out of alignment with how humans are supposed to live in a fast-paced industrial society. Of course, it has nothing to do with that, quote unquote, I'm being sarcastic here. Of course, it has a lot to do with that, and stuff of this sort. But people still kind of foolishly believe these old, outdated myths and make serious medical decisions, about their mental or physical health based off those things. And, the U.S. isn't that great with their health education, you know what I mean? And a lot of people, struggling from a lot of mental or physical pain. Of course, there's a lot that goes into it. But one of the things is there's just a severe, abysmal lack of education regarding anything nutrition related. I mean, I can't tell you in 20 years of coaching how many people I run into that are plagued with being extremely overweight, having high blood pressure, cholesterol ratios are all over the place, high triglycerides, depression, etc., and that honestly believe they kind of understand nutrition, you know what I mean? And when you kind of question them on like, oh, what do you know about nutrition? What have you been trying? They're like, oh, the blue zone diet. They typically say like some kind of silly, trendy diet, or they say something like very vague or simplistic, like I'm just eating less, or I took out sugar, and somehow that's going to solve, all of your metabolic issues by taking out sugar, etc. So there's a large percentage of people that are just problem unaware, and it's kind of difficult to communicate anything to them. Because oftentimes they're in such deep states of normalized pathology, it's tough for them to see how far gone they really are. You know what I mean? So the information I'm discussing here today is moreover for the problem-aware crowd. That's the second stage of change. The first stage, there are 4 stages to change. The first one is the problem-unaware. That's pretty much 90% of people are there. Then the second stage, Gary, what is going on? Joey as well, good to see you. Then the second stage is problem aware, but some people get stuck here for quite a long time as well because of like ambivalence, like, they hate their job, but they like the pay, you know what I mean? Or stuff of this sort, they're kind of stuck in this kind of gray area. But some people get stuck in the second stage of change too, because they simply don't know what to do. So they may actually really do honestly want to change, like they want to improve their nutrition and health, but they just don't have the knowledge. And oftentimes they're quite busy as well. And their bandwidth for what information they consume is quite limited because oftentimes people are in really deep stages of adrenal fatigue. So what they can handle is quite limited. Feeling so much better. Yeah, Joey, we're going to talk about how to source high quality beef today. Okay. And I'm going to make it obvious. I'm going to give everything away for free. And this isn't going to help the 90% of people that are problem unaware, but it will help the people that are problem aware, but just don't know what to do. And we'll cover that here. And you guys, if you guys have any questions whatsoever, I do these lives mainly for you. So feel free to ask. I may not have the answer, but I'll try my best to answer. So I'm going to go down the list. Like I mentioned before, like I do on all my solo casts, none of these things are more important than others. So they might be more important in certain portions of your journey than others, etc. But these are the things like I would personally look for when sourcing high quality beef in the US that ideally has a very, very low toxic load, because there's a lot of agrochemicals used in American food production, gargantuous amounts of synthetic herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, pesticides. I mean, you name it. It's the whole entire alphabetical order is there. Antonio, good to see you. Gary as well. And stuff of that sort. So, you guys, down to the point. And I know a lot of you guys will be doing grocery shopping this weekend. Most people do their grocery shopping on Saturday and Sunday. So here's some things you can look for. So when sourcing the highest quality beef, in high quality, I'm defining it as very nutrient dense, and also ideally a very low chemical load profile. Okay, so the first thing you want to look for is to make sure that the animal you're eating, in this case beef, cattle, is fed a species-specific diet. And it's important to know what a species-specific diet is for cattle. So cattle are herbivores naturally. That is their natural species-specific diet. And one of the things that helps optimize the nutritional profile of the meat, thus it has all of the myriad of macro and micromolecules. There may be like thousands upon thousands of micromolecules, many of which we don't even know yet, are able to test for yet, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, when the animal's meat and organs, et cetera, is nutrient dense and you eat it, you absorb those nutrients as well, because you can't get those nutrients from anywhere. And again, if you're eating sick animals and plants, you yourself cannot expect to be healthy. And it's kind of like smoking. You could eat poorly for quite a while, but eventually it catches up to you and you get like digestive disorders, various skin issues, maybe various metabolic issues, aesthetic challenges, maybe weird things going on with your nails or hair, et cetera, poor skin quality, stuff of this sort. So you want to make sure they're fed a species-specific diet, and for cattle, that would be herbivore. They're herbivores, so they eat like grass and other forage, and that is their species-specific diet. So when they're eating grass, especially a large variety of grass, you need a good amount of diversity. And for instance, in any wild grassland prairie, you get about 3 to a dozen different species of grass. And as the cattle are grazing on this grass, they're consuming these different types of vegetation, and thus acquiring the nutrients from those from that grass as well, from that forage. And then as you eat the animal, you'll acquire those nutrients as well. So that's kind of how it works. The second thing you want to look for is to make sure that the animal has a omega-3 to omega-6 ratio of about 1:1. Omega-3, in short, it's kind of like both of these micronutrients, micromolecules, are quite important. They're important for your health. But the problem is when the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 becomes quite high in omega-6 and quite low in omega-3, and you have that on a chronic basis in your diet, you'll develop chronic inflammation in your body, systemic inflammation. Inflammation, you can look up inflammation theory of disease. Close to probably 98% of disease arises just from chronic inflammation setting the foundation to poor health in a person. And one of the biggest contributors of chronic inflammation in a person's diet is chronic inflammation in a person's body, is just their diet, a diet that is very high in omega-6 and very, very low in omega-3, which basically is the American diet. So the American diet, depending on the source you look at, you're probably looking at, for every 1 omega-3, you get like 15, 20 omega-6s. So it's quite pro-inflammatory. Omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory micronutrient, et cetera. So, but when animals are fed a species-specific diet, so if a cattle just kind of grazes on grass all its life, its omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is going to be like 1:1, or maybe 2 or 3 omega-3s for every 1 omega-6. And that's the kind of ratio you want to look for in your animal products, that very close 1-to-1-ish ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. That's going to be very important. On top of, are they fed a species-specific diet? And usually if they are fed a species-specific diet, a balanced diet, high in diversity, their omega-3 to omega-6 is going to be a good ratio of about 1-to-1, okay? And usually in factory farmed meat, what you get oftentimes is a very high omega-6 ratio. And the reason for that is because factory farmed animals inevitably are fed a tremendous amount of grain. So obviously you guys have seen pictures of factory farms. They have these highly concentrated animal feeding operations, like chickens are in barns, cattle are in kind of feedlots, et cetera, and they don't go anywhere. So obviously when the animal isn't going anywhere, isn't foraging for its food, the farmer has to bring the food to the animal. And with meat operations, at least in the US, the most expensive aspect, which accounts for 80% of the animal operation, is basically feeding the animal. It's quite expensive. And to reduce the costs, farmers usually just use subsidized commodities like corn and soy. And corn and soy are going to be like very, very hard, or other grains, very, very high in omega-6s. So as the animal is fed a lot of this corn and soy, obviously the omega-6 is going to shoot up quite a bit, because the omega-6 the omega-6 is in the shell of the grain, and as the animal consumes this grain, obviously it kind of, the nutritional profile of the meat then mimics whatever the animal's diet is. Kind of that old saying you guys probably heard, you are what your food eats, you know what I mean, or something of that sort. So, and the reason a lot of farmers do this is economics. It's subsidized by the taxpayer. A lot of these grains, corn and soy especially, heavily subsidized. So it reduces the cost of the operation quite a bit. And that's one of the tricky things. Sometimes people are like, well, the more higher quality beef, it's like, $2 or $3 more per pound, et cetera, for like a ground beef item, for example. But the thing is, it's like the American taxpayer is already paying for the lower quality beef. It seems like it seems like the price is lower at the supermarket, but really it's because you're prepaying about like $1 or $2 in terms of your tax dollars going to these subsidized programs to bring that price lower. So really it is costing you, but just kind of like indirectly. And then on top of that, there's the whole, I'm not going to get too much into it on this slide, but the whole vertical integration model of farming in the US, where a lot of bigger companies take over smaller farms. But then if those smaller farms go out of business, then the taxpayer bails out the farmer as well, with tax subsidies. So there's a lot going on there too. But the 2 points we covered so far is A, make sure your beef is fed a species-specific diet. So they're herbivores, so they should be eating just grass and other similar forage. And ideally, a diversity of forage as well to optimize the nutritional profile. The next thing you want to focus on is making sure the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is 1-to-1 or close to there. It doesn't have to be perfectly 1-to-1, but very close to there. And if the animal is fed a species-specific diet, in this case, if the cattle are grazing on grass all of their life and not supplemented with grain, just naturally the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio should be 1-to-1. All right. And the third thing to consider, what I look for, and I've done a research study with Dr. Jason Runtree at Michigan State University regarding this, is AA amyloid accumulation. And this is more to do if you're into eating the organs of the animal. Although AA amyloids do accumulate in the muscle tissue of the animal, but to a much, much lower extent. And AA amyloids are basically amyloids that are produced by the liver of the animal. And typically when the animal is highly inflamed and very chronically stressed, they produce quite a bit of what's referred to as SAA amyloids, serum amyloids. And it's normal to produce these amyloids at a lower quantity, but when they're chronically being produced at a high amount, they start breaking off into AA amyloids. And AA amyloids are not able to be metabolized by the animal's body, so they get deposited as plaque around the organ tissue of the animal. And at that point, it's permanent. It just kind of builds up. And there aren't any conclusive human studies in terms of what exposure to these AA amyloids in a diet would do, but in some animal studies, it does cause a few health complications, okay? So obviously, as you eat these organs with this plaque there, they're going to build around as plaque around your tissue, most likely your organ tissue, and possibly cause health issues as well. And it seems that the variables that are responsible for these AA amyloids being accumulated in the animal's tissue are, one, confinement. So when they're confined, like shoulder to shoulder, they're very stressed, and then their liver produces a lot more of these AA amyloids, or serum amyloids, but then break off into AA amyloids where they're being produced to higher amounts. Another thing is just excessive exposure to various bacteria and viruses. This causes a chronic inflammatory response as well, and the liver then produces a lot more of these AA amyloids. And give me one sec. Kind of forgot to put it on focus mode, getting all these text messages here. Okay, and then another thing is certain vaccines actually produce a lot of excessive AA amyloid production in the animal too. So when you're combining highly concentrated animal feeding operations where animals are just basically stacked shoulder to shoulder and living in their own feces, basically, you guys have seen a lot of these factory farmed documentaries. They're basically walking around, uh, 2 to 3 inch densities of feces. And then obviously when they have a lot of this fecal amount of exposure, they have to be fed a lot of antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. And that's also the case because they're fed a non-species specific diet in these factory farmed operations. And then they're also given a lot of vaccines, and a lot of these vaccines produce excessive AAA amyloids as well. So that's another thing to consider. So that's why I encourage people to eat pasture-raised meats. In some very rare situations, if the animal happened to be very, very sick before processing, they may actually also have AA amyloid plaque deposits around their organ tissue and to a very, very smaller amount around their muscle tissue. But it's very rare, where in factory farmed operations, it's a lot more common. So something to consider. So now, since we know kind of like the variables to look for, the next step is, how do we find this high quality beef without getting confused by all the greenwashing? Greenwashing is basically labels that kind of make a product look a lot healthier than it is, like all natural. When you see that pretty much means nothing. Okay, all natural means it's just not made in a laboratory, so it doesn't really say much, or stuff of this sort. And a lot of Americans that are trying to have good intentions on making good health conscious choices often get lost with all of this greenwashing. And that's what we're going to cover here. So first and foremost, when you see on beef products like Prime, Choice, Select, when you see Prime, a lot of people get that confused with like super high quality. But from one vantage point, you can look at that as like the least healthiest out of the options rather, because Prime, Choice, and Select basically indicate how much fat is on the meat. Now, before you guys kind of jump to conclusions, fat is very healthy. Animal fat is very, very healthy for you, okay? But the problem with factory farmed animals and their fat is, unfortunately, and this happens with humans as well, a lot of the chemicals get deposited in the fat tissue. So with humans, for example, just so it's a little bit more relatable, your body tries to prioritize the health of its organs above all else, because you could survive without your left arm, but you can't survive without your liver, for example, or your heart or your brain, et cetera, et cetera. So when the toxicity is building up too high in that organ tissue, the visceral tissue, your body creates more fat stores at the periphery of its body, kind of further away from its organs, and kind of starts storing the chemical residue there. This is one of the reasons why people that are heavy and try to lose weight maybe complain about having headaches, the first few weeks of weight loss. Because as you're losing weight, you have a lot of those chemicals being stored in the fat tissue. And as the fat begins to be metabolized, you're losing fat basically, it gets circulated back into your bloodstream and stuff of this sort. And then eventually it gets excreted through your basically going to the bathroom and stuff and sweating and stuff of that sort. But that's why a lot of people develop headaches. And it's the same with animals. So with cattle, for example, let's just say it's a feedlot factory farmed operation, which is basically, in terms of volume, like 98% of beef sold in the US. They're using antibiotics, possibly beta agonists, various steroids that they implant as like a pellet in the animal's ear, and then it kind of like just distributes usually like estrogen into the animal. They're feeding them a lot of corn and soy or other grains that are grown with various herbicides, like popular ones are atrazine or Roundup Ready, which the active ingredient is glyphosate, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of Americans also are kind of confused about, the safety testing behind a lot of these chemicals. So in terms of complete formulation, I've covered this extensively on other podcasts, so I'm not going to do this here, but I will post it in the comments section. There are no safety testing done on complete formulations of, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, whatever, any other synthetic biocides, there are no safety testing done as a complete formulation. So, for example, just trying to see, I don't have anything here. Okay, I bought this mushroom supplement. This is just a random example, okay? So in any kind of pesticide, you can go to Home Depot and they sell like Roundup, for example. You can look at the back of the label, right? And at the back of the label, it would always say active ingredient and then inactive or inert ingredients. And the active ingredient is the main player, but it could be maybe half of the formulation, or it could be 0.5% of the 0.5% of the formulation, or even less, okay? In all safety testing in the US and even in Western Europe requires is just for them to test the active ingredient in isolation on its own, which it's never used that way, you know? It's used as a complete formulation at the end product, and that's what you're being exposed to as a complete formulation. And the reason for those inactive ingredients, which could be either 99% of the formulation or maybe 50% of the formulation, is to make the active ingredient a lot stronger and more resistant to weather conditions or whatever is required in that particular environment. Because like with Roundup Ready, there's like hundreds of different formulations depending on the specific task that the farmer needs that herbicide to do on that particular environment, okay? So they're never tested for safety. And the average American newborn born in a metropolitan area in America is already born with 120 different industrial or agricultural chemicals in their bloodstream already. And, you know, some people would foolishly then say like, oh, you know, like we're living longer, you know, whatever. And I'm going to break this down in a few different topics. And how is it that I'm living longer, so many healthy people? So first of all, there are no healthy Americans left. There isn't. Just go ahead and do a simple Google search, you know, at the end of this live, and you'll see that 9 out of 10 Americans are metabolically sick. So meaning metabolic health is defined as, you know, your body fat percentage, your resting blood glucose levels, blood pressure, triglycerides, and HDL. And these 5 variables are like the ABCs of fitness, of health. I mean, they're literally like the ABCs. Imagine when a person comes to you and they're trying to convince you that they have like a PhD in English and they don't even know the ABCs. So when a person has poor metabolic health, that's an indication that they don't even know the ABCs. And that's what I'm referencing of in terms of the problem unaware crowd in America. And you only need to be out of range for government standards in 2 of those variables that I listed to be considered metabolically sick. I would say just out of range in 1, and you're still considered metabolically sick. And metabolic health isn't like you need to be an Olympian, you know what I mean, or stuff of this sort. I mean, it's like literally the ABCs. It's like, do I know the alphabetical order? That's it. And if you do, then you're metabolically healthy, for example, because it's just that easy. And if you don't, and I still get very foolish people, usually born in like the 60s or 70s, they're still like brainwashed by the symptom management model of healthcare. Not everyone, there are no absolutes, but a bulk majority of them still think like their high blood pressure is genetic or their triglycerides is genetic because their dad had it, but really it's just their dad had a belief system that you adopted, and then you live the same exact way whether you like it or not to admit it. And that's why you're developing health problems, because you're living out of alignment with how the human body has evolved to live, and has it really even changed in 250,000 years? So it's same thing with excess weight. Trust me, it's not genetics. No way. Okay, there's almost no obese people before 1970. And again, human DNA hasn't freaking changed in like 250,000 years for the Homo sapiens. So don't even start with this genetic nonsense, okay? All right, so Prime Choice Select doesn't really say much. It just basically the amount of fat that's accumulated on the animal, and Prime has the most amount of fat. So it could potentially have the most amount of chemical residue in that fat if you eat it, etc., etc. something too, I mean, this is kind of like not that important of a variable to focus on, but it does kind of contribute a little bit. Factory farm meats does make it a bit tougher for you to lose weight because they're usually much higher in fat. So they're going to be much higher in calories, right? And thus it's going to be tough for you to establish that caloric deficit consistently. On top of the chemical residue would be higher too, if you're not cutting off this fat and actually eating it. So another thing, let me just get a sip here. Jerry is asking, yes, Jerry is saying there are a couple of different of omegas, and that's true. There's omega-3, 6, and 9. I'm just referencing the two most popular ones here. So, okay, another thing where people get lost on is a lot of grass-fed claims. So you see grass-fed and grass-finished or 100% grass-fed, et cetera, or pasture-raised. Okay, that's another one. So let's cover what these mean. So first of all, when you see grass-fed on a product, you have to understand that all cattle are grass-fed. So there are different stages of cattle production, and usually there's an independent business that runs each stage. Like rarely do you see each person kind of manage all stages of the cattle production chain. So 80% of the cattle's life, all cattle's life, is basically spent on pasture, usually eating grass, which is their natural species-specific diet, that of a herbivore, like we mentioned in the beginning. But what happens is, towards the finishing phase, probably 95% of cattle are sent to a feedlot. And a feedlot is kind of, I have a picture here in my book. I'll show you guys. Let me just find it. Okay, here we go. So a feedlot is kind of like this. You see, they're all kind of condensed, like shoulder to shoulder. And this is how pretty much 95% of cattle are finished, okay? They're sent to this feedlot and they're fed heavy amounts of grain, which isn't a species-specific diet. And the reason this is done, like I mentioned before, it's for economical reasons, but also it allows the animal to gain weight quickly. And meat production is kind of like a pound industry. You know, the more pounds you get on the animal, the more money you're going to make typically. And then combine that with just heavy subsidization of, remember, the feed is 80% of the cost. So imagine if like I came to you and said like, hey, I could reduce your expenses by like 50%. If you just do this, if you use this product, you probably use that product, you know, if it meant saving like $2,000, $3,000 a month in your mortgage and car rent or whatever, you know what I mean? And stuff of that sort. And, but the problem is this short but intense exposure of grains shoots the omega-6 way up in the meat product. And basically then you get that ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. So now it's like a pro-inflammatory food. On top of that, when you don't feed an animal a species-specific diet and you feed them a lot of grains, the animal gets sick, just like humans. When you don't feed them real food and you're feeding them a lot of processed food or alcohol, they get overweight and sick and their skin doesn't look good, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then as they get sick, they have to be given a lot of antibiotics or various other drugs that make it into the nutritional profile of the meat. And then you end up being exposed to all this as well. You know, so it's kind of like you want to look at it as like a closed ecosystem. You know, whatever they're exposed to in one chain of the ecosystem, you're part of that loop. Okay. So that's very important to consider. And that's what you want to kind of think of when you see grass-fed. It's not a very strong label because all cattle are grass-fed, but the majority of them are grain finished. So they're finished on a non-species specific diet. The more appropriate labels you want to look for, but you still want to be a little bit more careful with these, is grass-fed and grass-finished. That's kind of what you want to look for. You got to be careful with this one too, because some operations, because it's the grass-fed labeling claims in the U.S., it doesn't have a lot of quite heavy oversight. So sometimes they would feed a cattle grass, let's say for 70% of its life, then switch them over to grains for maybe like 2 months just to really bulk them up, then finish them on grass for like a week, and then sell it as grass fed and grass finished. But there's a lot of grain exposure in that product as well, so it's something to consider. Even stronger label claim is like 100% grass fed. That would mean they're grass fed literally throughout their entire life. Some things you may want to ask are they roaming outside and eating a diversity amount of grass? Remember, like a wild grassland prairie, for example, has 3 to 10 or 12 different species of grass on that grassland. And as the cattle are roaming around, they're getting exposure to this large diversity of nutrients, and then those nutrients are making it into the nutritional profile of the meat. Some companies to look for, you guys can check out AmericanGrassFed.org. You can go on that website today, scroll to the bottom, and they have an interactive map, like to the bottom slightly right. You can click on that map, and they'll have a map of the U.S., all of the states, and it'll show you where all of the certified ranches are. All right, and these are all American Grass-Fed certified ranches, and American Grass-Fed certification label, the AGA label, it's like the gold standard for grass-fed products. So there are on-site inspections once every 15 months. And this might seem like not a lot, but it's a huge upgrade compared to not having any on-site inspections and just basically filling out some paperwork and trusting the person, all right? And the reason they inspect it once every 15 months is so they can inspect the ranch every season, which is important too, because some seasons they could be 100% grass-fed. But other seasons, let's say during a very, very cold climate, it might not actually be the case, and they might be supplementing a lot with grains or something of that sort. So that's why it's important to kind of have that seasonal inspection to see how the ranch is doing each season. All right. Some other websites you can check out eatwild.com is a great resource. You can go to the top left, if I remember correctly, and click on the meat, milk, and eggs tab, and it'll have an interactive map. This actually includes Canada as well. And it'll show you all of the legitimate pasture-raised operations. Some of these operations may be grass-fed certified, American grass-fed certified, but I don't think a lot of them are. Where the operations listed on the AmericanGrassFed.org website, they're all certified by the American Grass-Fed Organization or Association. All right, which is the gold standard in America for grass-fed, legitimate grass-fed products. And they require the product to be grown and harvested in the USA. Because another thing you guys want to be careful of is sometimes in the grocery store, you see product of the USA on meat products, on beef products. And what this legally means is simply that it's packaged in the USA. Where in the consumer's mind, they think it's like basically grown and harvested and packaged in the USA, but it's not the case. It's just packaged in the USA. So they can import a carcass from like Mexico, for example, to California, process it, package it, and it could be legally considered a product of the USA still. It wasn't always the case, but this is, again, what happens with lobbying, and when a lot of companies get into politics and stuff of this sort. They kind of change the rules in their favor. Some other websites to check out. You can check out Force of Nature Meats. You can Google Force of Nature Meats. They're a very good, credible company. Or the place where I learned about legitimate, wild, pasture-raised meat, beef operations. And that's with my mentor, Frank Fitzpatrick, at the number 5, barbeef.com, 5barbeef.com. And his cattle are literally 100% wild cattle. So he started his herd, if I'm not mistaken, 30 years ago. It's been quite a long time. And what he did is kind of like natural selection, what would happen in nature anyways. And he let the cattle that weren't able to survive in that particular environment kind of slowly die out. And he wouldn't treat them or anything. And then the cattle that survived were able to breed much stronger cattle that were able to survive and thrive in that particular environment. So fast forward 20 or 30 years, you have a herd now that has a very robust immune system for that particular environment, and he doesn't dehorn his cattle, which is a very popular practice. He doesn't clip the bulls, doesn't use antibiotics, doesn't use any vaccines, no steroids, nothing. And the cattle, especially the bulls, are, I worked with them, for like a year and a half, like very strong, very robust. They're very, very healthy, very vital, etc., etc. Very lean as well. So that's another great resource too. Okay, 5. All right, give me a sec, guys. Let me just get a sip here. Okay, so we're almost done. We got 2 more topics here I want to cover. The organic versus non-organic labels. So this one is the most confusing probably for people, even if I explain it. You could have a factory farmed operation that's certified organic. I know a lot of people think that's kind of crazy. They're like, whoa, what's up with organic? So organic in the US as of today is more about what type of inputs go into the operation rather than heavily focused on the animal's welfare. So you can have cattle in a feedlot, like I showed you here in this book, kind of condensed, all cramped up in a single intense feedlot operation, and feed them organic corn and soy or other grains, and that could still be certified as organic, for example. You know what I mean? Or you could have like a pasture-raised operation. You can see here, they're kind of walking outside, there's a bunch of trees, they have all this sunshine, etc. And that could also be certified organic. You know what I mean? So that's a little bit confusing for some people. You could also have like the 100% grass-fed and USDA organic certified labels on the same label. That would be a very strong combination, actually. If you see like grass-fed and grass-finished or 100% grass-fed plus that USDA organic certification logo, that's a very, very strong group of logos, meaning it's indicative of very high quality, nutrient dense and chemical free meat. So when I say chemical free, it's not like it's going to have 0 chemical residue. I think that's kind of like impossible to attain these days, because you have like in the US, probably with 70% of rainwater in a lot of places in the US, you have glyphosate, a very dangerous herbicide in the samples of 70% of rainwater in a lot of states in the US, you know what I mean? So obviously these clouds are going and raining down on organic farms and stuff of this sort. That's why usually when you see certified organic, it indicates 95% organic, because a lot of times it's really impossible to claim it's literally 100% organic and stuff of this sort. So a little bit of confusion there, but that's something important to consider. I think the organic label is quite strong in the US. It's still a good label because it also not only indicates that the food that's fed to the animals hasn't been grown with a gargantuous amount of synthetic biocides like pesticides, fungicides, rodenticides, etc., but it also indicates that the beef in this case hasn't been administered antibiotics, steroids, beta agonists, and not fed genetically modified corn and soy, which are all good things to avoid, so that label kind of guarantees pretty well actually that you're not getting exposure to those things, okay? And for example, there's a study in like 2009 called, I forgot the number, but you guys can look it up on pubmed.gov and find it probably in 2 seconds. Estrogen concentrations in beef and human hormone-dependent cancers. This was done in Japan. And Japan started at that time importing quite a bit of beef from the US. And this is actually like a pretty good study that I like because they tested meat that they directly found at the supermarket. So in Japan. So this is what you are exposed to as a consumer. This wasn't done in kind of like a laboratory. They went to the supermarket, picked the beef directly from the supermarket, and then tested the meat. And the estrogen, in particular E2 concentrations in the meat were much, much higher in U.S. imported beef than the Japanese domestically grown beef, okay? And you want to be careful with a lot of these like synthetic hormones in your meats if you're eating the meat on a very consistent basis, because remember, you're composed of everything you eat. So if you're eating sick animals and plants grown with a lot of chemicals, then it shouldn't be any surprise that you start developing health issues yourself. It's just kind of like goes hand in hand, you know? It's weird, but you got to kind of remember that you're made out of food. Everything about you is made out of food. You know, everything. Your body and your mind are both made out of food, and your mind produces your thoughts. So if you have like a sick mind because you're eating sick food all the time, you can't expect to have healthy thoughts. You know, it kind of works hand in hand. So, okay. Do you guys have any questions about the organic label? That one gets the most confusion. So it's a good label, but you got to be conscious of like what you're getting out of it, you know? Like the big thing is sometimes I get people saying like, oh, I bought this like cereal that's organic. It's still like heavily processed, you know? You want to stick to food in its whole state form. So, you know, like beef, you know what I mean? Like the cut of beef. I would even avoid eating beef jerky often. You can, you know, but it's still processed to a certain degree and stuff of this sort. Like I try to save beef jerky for like trips, you know, when you're at a convention and you don't want to eat the junk food there, you can just get a bunch of these organic beef jerky sticks, put them in your pocket, and you can kind of snack on them throughout the day. And it keeps you quite full. And that way you don't feel tempted to kind of like eat the cookies or the other junk food they have there. So the last thing I want to cover is, you know, beef is a red meat product, but there are other red meat products you can have too. So you can have more variety and diversity. You know, there's a lot of different cuts of beef. So I would recommend just trying to have as many of those cuts as possible to have good diversity. But there are also a lot of other red meat products. So like I eat a lot of elk and deer quite often. Okay. There's also bison is a very, very good and healthy red meat product that also, all three of these have a great omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in their meat profiles. And you don't have to hunt to eat elk or eat deer, etc., etc. You can go to a company called like Force of Nature Meats, I mentioned them earlier, and purchase from them. They also sell a lot of their products in like the frozen section at like Sprouts, Whole Foods, Natural Grocers. Natural Grocers also is great because they sell American grass-fed certified beef. And not many grocery stores sell that. So if you do have a natural grocer in your area, that's a cool advantage to have. Or you could just go to americangrassfed.org. Again, scroll to the bottom of the website to the site right, and then click on that interactive map. And most ranchers, they kind of deliver to you these days. So you don't have to pick one directly in your state, but you can see if there are any in your state and you can support the local guy, which is also super cool. So there you have it. How to optimize your beef purchase. There's a lot more nuance to it, guys. There's, you know, a million rabbit holes we can go down to here, but that's kind of the general picture. If you understand it from that level, you're solid. And trust me, you're like at, in terms of sourcing high quality beef in the US, you're like at 0.00000000001% of the US population's understanding of how to source high quality beef at that point, even at this level. So I hope that was helpful, and have a good weekend. Okay, guys, take care.